Great. Yeah, we can just move the slides whenever we're ready to start. I'll just start going, and I think you can just cut it.
Wonderful. I'm ready.
Actually, Gavin, can you go back to the start? Great, and we'll start now. Okay. Thank you. So our team's presentation will focus on remittance flows in the Philippines as a case study for remittance economics. We'll be discussing current roadblocks to long-term economic development and providing some policy recommendations to manage remittance flows into the Philippines. Great. So remittances are monetary transfers, usually between a worker who's abroad and then a recipient in a host country. And those can take the form of direct cash payments or wire transfers, or what we're seeing now more and more are online transfers using virtual services. And per annum, they account for almost 500 billion US dollars transferred around the globe, which in some dwarfs other capital flows entering developing countries. The total remittance flows into developing countries is about 3 times the sum of official development aid and FDI each year combined. But despite the size of remittances in developing economies, there are limited government strategies to effectively manage their use in macroeconomic development or to regulate their inflow into domestic economies. Part of that is because economists have found mixed results as to whether or not remittances are actually an effective tool to promote economic development. Some studies have found positive benefits of remittance flows to encourage economic development. However, other economists found when you can control for lots of other variables in developing economies, the benefits become marginal without strong institutional support and better economic regulation, especially in the banking sector. So to encourage a better study of how remittances can influence an economy positively, we're going to focus on a single case study. So our group chose the Philippines to investigate for 3 main reasons. The first is that it's a major player in the remittance economy. It's the world's 4th largest receiver of remittances in terms of monetary value. It accounts for about 35.1 billion US dollars per year, which is also a significant share of its economy. 10% of its GDP is made up of remittances. And in the Philippines, remittances have increased every year consistently since 1998. So they're going to continue to be a growing part of the Philippines economy. The second is that the Philippines is a middle income country, which has some of the basic established infrastructure for remittance regulation. The economy is also in a good state of middle development where GDP is growing, but the country is going to need more efficient investment and economic regulation to continue to support domestic growth, particularly while domestic investment is falling and inequality is growing in the economy. And third, the Philippines already has demonstrated capability and interest in remittance reform. The Philippine Central Bank collects some of the best data on remittance patterns of any economy in the world. And the Philippine government has also previously worked directly with remittance providers to better regulate transactions and has focused its international economic policy on expanding foreign labor abroad with labor deals with countries like Japan and other regional partners to encourage more of its citizens and nationals to work abroad and continue to send remittances into the economy.
Okay, so in order to start analyzing our case study, we wanted to get a good idea of who exactly was receiving remittances within the Philippines and have our policy suggestions follow those demographic characteristics of remittance receipt. And so actually, when we investigated the Philippines in particular, we found some interesting results that are unusual among large remittance receiving countries. So the first thing that we noticed is that the households that are receiving remittances in the Philippines are actually relatively wealthy. So as we can see, a majority of the households actually fall into the top quartile of income receivers, of income earners within the Philippines, and almost 80% of them are in the top 50% of earners. And we also can see that not only is income relatively strong, but remittances make up only around 30 to 40% of the total household income. Now, both of these facts are unusual among remittance receiving countries in general. This is because we usually expect to see remittance receivers to fall into kind of the second or bottom quartile of income receivers. And generally, remittances make up a much larger percentage of their income, even as much as making up essentially all of their income. But in this case, we saw that the opposite was true. And most of these households had a secondary source of income that actually accounted for more of their total income each year. And also, okay. So the challenge, with that being said, the challenges faced in the Philippines are severalfold. First of all, maintaining formal remittance flows, we thought, is a key priority for the Philippines. The Philippines is actually relatively good at this already, with a large amount of their remittances going through formal sources already. But as the policy environment for remittances changes, so too do the considerations for remittance centers about whether or not to use competing informal remittance service providers. And it's important for data collection reasons and reasons that Ayina will talk about to keep those flows formalized as much as possible. The second challenge has to do with sustainable economic growth. So there's been increasingly limited domestic economic opportunity, which has led to persistent unemployment in the Philippines. The government has responded by essentially sending workers abroad to find employment through formal work agreements and formal work programs. And so that's actually had a large effect on the mix of people who have been sent abroad. So like I said, generally these remittance receivers are quite wealthy. And we also see this reflected in their kind of education background, these sort of things. So not only are the heads of households who remain in the Philippines generally well educated, but so too are the people who are sent abroad. And this is largely because the Philippines has created a private system for competitive hiring of overseas migrants and their placement in jobs abroad. And generally these positions are elementary and don't require large amounts of skill, but nonetheless, the people who get sent tend to have a relatively good education. And so that's part of this dynamic here. At the same time, there's been falling private investment and increasing inflation risk. So the goal is to translate this sort of program and these sort of characteristics and these remittances into better economic growth given these risks. Finally, reducing poverty and inequality. So remittances, again, are transfers, from more developed countries to developing countries. And our hope would be to develop policies which will reduce inequality within the countries that are receiving these cash transfers. And in fact, the Philippines, as it's developed, has seen increasing inequality. But at the same time, the government has a proven ability to intervene in the remittance space, and remittances have a proven ability to reduce the severity of poverty. In fact, the Asia Development Bank has estimated that a 1% increase in remittance flows can lead to a 14% decrease in the severity of poverty. So there's a strong incentive there to use these funds well. So with that, we turn to our policy solutions.
So our first policy would be working to improve formal remittance retention. This is really important to that the government should continue to make better use of the remittances and get better data on how remittances are being used and who is receiving them. So the first way to work on this would be by creating incentive schemes. So this would be things like allowing the Filipino migrant workers to deposit remittances in reputable foreign currency accounts with domestic banks. And we would also recommend that the government make products that they can only get on formal platforms. For example, some migrants do not want their family members in the Philippines to spend all the money that they send. And so creating a product like a trust in domestic banks would be helpful because this will turn migrant workers towards the more formal platforms because of the new products that they have. We also think that it would be important for the government to create a centralized service to collect and distribute remittances to different banks within the Philippines. This would make it easier for companies and formal platforms to set up their remittances. So for example, India has a similar system where they have a centralized infrastructure, which allows remittance companies to not have to form agreements with every local bank and cuts down administration costs. Next, we would think that public and private partnership will also be important. So one of the problems, one of the reasons why people are turning towards the informal structure is because of they have lower fees. The formal platforms have higher fees because of administrative costs that come from how hard and having transactions with different banks in whatever country are. And so by making these costs lower, they can also lower the costs for the that the platforms are charging, which will incentivize people to move to more formal platforms. So for example, we would like public and private partnership through the government working with these platforms such as Western Union or MoneyGram to find out the best practices and models for remittance receiving policies and for creating infrastructure that will help most efficiently deliver remittances, which in the long run would lead to lower fees. We can also have the government subsidize or match remittance fees for the companies. And we would also have the government work with private financial institutions to expand their presence past developed areas in the Philippines, which will make the cost cheaper for these platforms because now people have better access to financial institutions. Finally, obviously, financial literacy and making sure that people understand the best practices and why using formal platforms is safer and giving them financial security.
Thanks so much, Ina. So now I'm going to discuss poverty reduction. So with the goal of increasing job access and consumer spending on education, health, and savings that has the long-term benefits associated with poverty reduction, the government and market both have a role to play. So starting out with their joint role, the public-private partnerships, as Gavin pointed out, many remittance centers are wealthy in the Philippines. This is because in the Filipino government makes work programs with different countries, and these are operated privately. So job selection and workers chosen for those positions are chosen competitively. Those with university degrees are filling jobs that are required by more elementary skill levels. This hurts local economic growth by taking human capital out of the economy, and they're not necessarily returning with new skills. And also this way, remittance sending is not being received by the lowest income workers in the country. So we have two public-private suggestions to help combat this. One is directly to the work programs. This idea is based on the precedent that the Filipino government has already set in administering work placement programs abroad and aims to increase job and remittance access for these low-income populations. So the three suggestions are, firstly, create a government program targeted at low-income workers and pair them with appropriate job placements abroad. Second would be to mandate certain positions or projects be filled by low-income applicants. For example, the government could put a skill ceiling on a placement into a domestic service. And thirdly, the government could continue to broker formal agreements with other countries, and it can seek to secure hiring agreements for jobs which are well matched the skill levels that exist within the country for lower income workers. Our second idea to do this public-private partnership was commitment devices. So a commitment device, I think as mentioned, would allow remittance senders to directly transfer the money to a target institution, allowing senders greater control of spending. Evidence from randomized trials by the Poverty Action Lab suggests that this is effective in increasing remittance sending. So for example, Filipino migrants in Rome sent 17.2% more funds back home to the Philippines when compared to those who did not have these commitment devices. And ways that this could work was like, firstly, creating a partnership between remittance sending companies and schools to allow migrants to transfer directly school fees, and maybe in exchange they could receive their pupils' grade information. Second could be having a similar partnership with hospitals to allow remittance senders to sell medical bills, which seems very apt given the current health pandemic. And third would be creating a partnership between remittance sending companies and local grocery stores, so you could buy store credit that your family could use to buy food. Moving on to the public sector, so the government's role. Our main idea here was to create a matching scheme, so matching of remittance funds spent on healthcare, education, and savings. Such programs could reduce the painful trade-offs with which poor receivers would otherwise have to make. So the Poverty Action Lab also did another research project into this and found that remittance matching, even at a 1-to-1 rate, increased spending on education through remittances by as much as 36%. And finally, the market. In addition to the Filipino government, remittance sending companies in the Philippines, the largest being Western Union, have a motive to encourage remittance receivers to use remittances as senders intend, to bolster savings, education, and health, because this increases the amount of remittances sent through their service. So, for example, merely using an ability to label your money as being desired for a purpose, a certain use, so that being able to label your money as, oh, this should be used for education, raises the amount of money sent by migrants by 15%. This is again another study done by the Poverty Action Lab in Rome. So the two specific recommendations here is, one, as described earlier, companies can introduce smart nudging through, for example, like labeling measures to increase spending in education, health, and business. And the second was they could have certain changes to their fee structure. So the first would be the receiver, not the sender, is charged upon withdrawal. Money would accumulate in the account, with the receiver facing a fee decreasing with the size of the withdrawal. The negative experience of facing the fee would discourage withdrawing from the account early and encourage saving. The second would be a flat fee. This would discourage frequent withdrawals, because the more money you have in the bank, the smaller proportion of your money that you're taking out, the fee would be. So this would also encourage saving. So I think now we're going to move on to our third and final section.
Thank you, Anunya. The final part of our presentation has to do with promoting sustainable business growth. So obviously a key driver for economic growth is the creation of sustainable domestic businesses. And we believe that the Philippines can grow its economy by leveraging the remittance flows to promoting their business growth. So the first way, before that, we think that the Philippines is a very great population for this, just because the economy and the population there is actually drawn towards entrepreneurship. So a global entrepreneurship monitor report shows that the Philippines is one of the top markets for female entrepreneurship, and they also have a population that is drawn towards entrepreneurship more so than other Asian countries. So the first way that the government can help in promoting business growth would be, as we said before, changing the mixture of the migrant workers. So if more overseas workers are more low-income people that have less skills, they can develop skills when they're abroad, and they can bring that back and work in businesses in the Philippines. But also, if we're able to keep the wealthier, more educated workers, instead of having a brain drain, those people are the ones that are primed for business creation, and they can start their own businesses with support. And secondly, we think the government needs to take advantage of opportunities and the desire for investment amongst the diaspora, which will likely expand as more overseas workers are being sent abroad. So we can harness this wealth by working with domestic banks and financial advisors to set up equity funds for upper-class remittance senders, and they can invest in promising small domestic businesses in the Philippines. We can also have a diaspora bond, which would be attractive to wealthier overseas workers that are interested in sustainable investing, specifically environmental and social governance. With regard to the market, we also want to encourage domestic entrepreneurs to invest in remittances themselves. So we would like the government to partner with banks to offer business loans at a reduced interest rate if the borrower is financing part of their business through remittances. We also want to facilitate remittance funded microfinance, and we can have the government match small business investments because these investments are really tiny. We'd also want to create financial education programs and classes that have to do with growing a business and being an entrepreneur for local entrepreneurs, and they can be paid through remittances using commitment devices, which we talked about previously. So these are the major ways that we would want to promote sustainable business growth using remittances. So finally, to conclude, our first recommendation would be formalizing remittance transactions. And it's important to do that so that the government can collect better data on remittance transactions, and also they can establish better economic policies. And we can do this by subsidizing fees, by having public and private partnerships with the formal platforms for remittances, and getting best practices, and also building best and better infrastructure and expanding financial institutions to less developed areas in the country. We also want to reduce poverty. We want to encourage remittance receivers to save and invest their money and use their remittances for worthwhile causes. And we can do this by changing the demographics of the overseas workers, by creating trust and commitment devices, and also changing the fee structures. Finally, we want to focus on small business development in order to support economic growth. And we think like by harnessing the wealth of the diaspora, by making entrepreneurship programs to support local entrepreneurs, and also by helping local entrepreneurs and incentivizing them to invest their remittances in their businesses, we would be able to do that. And so with following all these recommendations, we believe that the Filipino government can effectively manage remittances, which is a great source of hard currency, much better, and they can drive economic development and alleviate poverty. Thank you.